screen. Number of hours. Anybody want to venture a guess on that one? 8, 4, 5, 6, 7. Actually, what they found is 6 to 10 hours is spent on screen time, and that's a lot of screen time considering the lack of time being outside. The drop in Little League participation since 1997, this is a percentage as well. In other words, kids that are having less involvement with a sport like Little League. 30%. 30, 40, go down a little bit. Actually, it's 14%. But again, that's a fairly significant drop that's occurred in that way. Just a couple of other ones. The decline since 1965 of children aged 7 to 11 who swim, fish, or play touch football. That percentage is about 33%. So 1/3 less children participating in these kinds of activities since 1995. And then the decline in average overnight visit to U.S. national parks from 1987 to 2003. This is a percentage. Anyone want to guess on that one? Nobody want to venture a guess?
12.
Huh? 12? 40. Somewhere halfway in between. About 25%. Okay. There was just a study, and if I had an opportunity, which I didn't, I would have shown you the 2-minute clip. Last night on MSNBC, there was a little clip about the Nature Conservancy just did a study where they were looking at the decline of participation in park attendance and those kinds of things. And it's pretty much the same statistic, but it's pretty dramatic what's happened along those kinds of ways. I understand there was something in the Bloomington paper today as well about that. But this is really pretty dramatic kind of change in terms of the connections that people used to have with nature that may not have that any longer. Well, the other thing that I'd like to suggest to you is we've heard a lot, Louvre talks about children and nature deficit disorder, and I think that's really important, but I think it's not just about children, I think it's about all of us. And this quote from the CDC, evidence suggests that children and adults benefit so much from contact with nature that land conservation can now be viewed as a public health strategy. And so it's not just about individual enjoyment, it's about the health of communities in a much broader sense, about the health of a population. And that's children, but it certainly also is adults. Well, just a real brief kind of historical background for this, because I think it is kind of interesting. The whole issue with not being connected to nature is not really a brand new problem. You've all heard of Thoreau and Walden Pond, and in the mid-1800s, he went to live at Walden Pond to experience what it was like to live in nature, because at that point in time, he felt that civilization was encroaching upon the way people were living, and that somehow we had to figure out what this connection was to the outdoors. And obviously Thoreau was a very famous philosopher eventually. Most people thought he was crazy at the time he did these particular things, but the kinds of writing he did about that really started a real movement in terms of thinking about the value of the outdoors. Also, and many of you probably know this history, but the history of parks, of state parks and national parks, that whole focus began at the turn of the century, going into the 19th century. Going into the 20th century, at the end in the early 1900s. And that also was a concern that many people had, that we were losing wild areas, and we were losing places where people could enjoy nature, and we needed to reconnect ourselves with that. And fortunately for all of us, that movement occurred so that we were able to preserve beautiful national parks and state parks and many local areas as well. The other area that's got quite an interesting history, again, is camps for children. And many of those camps actually, some started about in the 1860s, but it was the very, very early 1900s that the number of camps for children exploded. And the reason that people wanted to send children to camp is because they felt the cities were unhealthy. And kids needed to get out into the fresh air and enjoy the countryside, enjoy the open air. And that was a much healthier place to be. And so a concern about children at that point not being connected to nature resulted in the establishment of many, many camps and to the fact that there are well over 10,000 camps in the U.S. today for children. But again, these things all happened over 100 years ago when this concern was there as well. Now, we really never solved the problem completely 100 years ago, but there were a number of things done to try to address it. And I would contend that we're sort of at that same place today. We recognize there's a huge problem. There is now another new set of alternatives possibly we can look at in terms of how do we look at children, nature, people in nature. I think there's also, and this is a little bit of a play on words, but the notion of biophilia and biophobia. Biophilia is loving nature, loving the outdoors, and biophobia is being afraid of it. And in many ways, I think there's kind of this love-hate, push-pull kind of thing going on in our society today. While there are many people who love the outdoors, there are many people who really fear it for lots of reasons. And I don't like things that are either or, so I think it's much more complicated than that. But I think the notion of biophilia and biophobia gives us something to think about, again, as we think about our own relationship as well as the relationship that our children, our students, our colleagues, whoever it is, has with the outdoors. So why this change? And again, back at the turn into the 20th century, in the early 1900s, there was certainly a lot of legitimate concerns, and many of those have just simply exacerbated since that time. There's what scientists often refer to as social ecological explanations, which suggest that there are personal reasons why maybe we're less connected to the outdoors. There's social reasons in terms of the world in which we live, and then there's community and environmental kinds of structures. And when you look at pictures like I'm showing here, that sense of how the environment has changed around us certainly has implications for why we're seeing some of the change. Why do people, particularly children, play outdoors less? Well, there's several reasons, and a number of these Lube talks about in his book. We have bigger homes on the same size lots, so less chance to play outside. And that's something maybe we don't think about, but in terms of there's less space available, we may not be viewing that outdoors, that small space close to us in a different way. More structured playtime. This is an interesting idea because it does raise some issues about sports and children's health. And that's a whole other issue that I won't get into tonight. But there's some suggestion that organized sports aren't necessarily making children healthier. It doesn't necessarily mean they're getting more physical activity. It doesn't necessarily mean they're outside more because so many of these sports are done inside. But structured playtime, and as a recreation person, I'm probably being blasphemous saying that maybe there's alternatives to structured playtime, but so much structured playtime doesn't necessarily involve the outdoors, whereas when